Hey guys, DMS here. Today I have for you a headphone with the presentation and imaging of speakers that I think will appeal to both gamers and audiophiles. Let's check it out. This is a Beyerdynamic TYGR 300R. It's a headphone that's marketed as a gaming headphone, but as an audiophile I had to see how much I'd like it for music as well, and you might be surprised what I found. Before I jump too far into it, I want to make the comparison that I think we're all going to see here, which is how similar this actually is to the DT880, a headphone that I highly recommended a while back. Now the DT880, this is a 600 ohm variant, can be a little bit bright at times. Many Beyers can, and we'll be comparing back and forth between these two headphones quite a bit. So if you don't know anything about the DT880, you should definitely check out my video on it. I will have that linked in the video description to watch after this, or before if you want. So let's get started with build and comfort. It just started raining outside, you might hear that a little bit. So build-wise, aside from color changes, this is almost identical to the DT880. There's a few things though that do set it apart. The back grills have holes that are just slightly larger, it's a little bit more open. The cable is still attached, still has the same metal yokes, but this headband is held on with Velcro and can be taken off. So you could technically swap on one that has more or less padding. The ear pads themselves are very similar, they're just a different color, but the internal dampening on the inside of the ear cup is actually the same one they use in the Omron Wireless. I found this change in internal dampening actually did make the headphone a little bit more comfortable, and it does account for some of the changes in frequency response over the DT880, but we'll get into that with time. I wish the cable was detachable, but it is a lot shorter than the DT880. This cable just reaches across my desk to my amp and has a little bit of slack, so I'm not going to be dealing with this massive monster of a cable running across my floor. The termination is 3.5mm stereo, it is threaded and comes with a 1/4 inch adapter. Just like the DT880, it's pretty comfortable. This padding is a little bit softer, and these pads on the ears aren't quite as worn in as my DT880, but this does help to hold it off my ears a little bit. Once the pads start to wear down, you will get more of the actual internal dampening sitting on your ears, and when that happens, you know it's probably about time to change your pads out. Which these pads are removable, but I haven't really found any aftermarket pads I like quite as much as the official Beyerdynamic ones. So let's talk about sound, and specifically the frequency response of this thing. So this headphone is a little bit V-shaped. Not necessarily in the same sense of many other Beyers though. The DT880 is a bit of a warm and bright sound. It still has sub roll-off, but is known for more of its peaky treble. This has about half as much treble as the DT880, but maintains sub-bass extension. What this means essentially is that this has deep sub-bass. It's not necessarily loud or boomy, it's not muddy, but it does have impactful deep sub-bass, specifically for a Beyerdynamic headphone. In fact, the sub-bass performance of this and the impact reminds me a lot of the DT1990 with the balance pads on it, which is a little bit of a V-shaped sound. But once again, this has about half as much treble as the DT880. Now this is a significantly lower impedance, as a 32 ohm headphone versus a 600 ohm headphone. I personally subscribe to the belief that the higher impedance Beyers are a little bit less sibilant in the highs, but because this one is cut down on those high frequencies quite a bit, it does feel like those high frequencies are nowhere near as peaky. So while this does, on some tracks, have peaks of treble and slight sibilance, it's not as much as the DT880, it's not as much as the DT1990, certainly not as much as things like the Beyer T1, and I personally find it to be very manageable. It does encourage me to listen at slightly lower volumes than I would with, say, the HD6XX, but I don't consider this to be a problem by any means because I've actually very much enjoyed the frequency response of this headphone. Female vocals can sound thin on very specific tracks, but the thinness in some female vocals and the brightness I get occasionally seems to be in very specific cases. This is not by any means across the board, and in almost every use case, I've been extremely pleased with how these sound. Now, I don't necessarily think this is going to be quite as accurate in the mid-range as something like the HD6XX, but the frequency response is very pleasing, it's very easy to just sit back and listen to, and it reminds me a lot of what my living room sounds like with surround sound. And with that said, let's talk about soundstage and imaging. These present themselves like speakers, not staging wise, because I actually think the 600 ohm DT880 have better soundstage, but these image just like my 5.2 surround in my living room, which I guess is good if you are actually using them as a gaming headphone, which is what they're marketed as. That laser sharp imaging is going to make it very, very easy to tell where sounds are coming from, which is great if you're playing pretty much any game. But the mix of this laser sharp imaging and this frequency response that's a bit more extended and has some sparkle to the highs really, really reminds me of speakers, and something about the presentation of these gives me the feeling of listening to an actual sound system. And there's only maybe 2 other headphones that have done that, and those headphones are well into the $4,000 plus range, whereas this, if you don't buy it in the bundled package with a microphone, is actually only $170-ish, $180-ish dollars. If you buy it with a microphone, I think it's $300. But this is by far the best imaging I've heard in a headphone under probably a couple $1,000s, which is really surprising because this is definitely in a budget range. Now, once again, like I said, the soundstage isn't crazy, but just the presentation and imaging is right there to the point where I am using this headphone a lot. So now let's talk about detail, separation, and amplification. As far as detail goes, I don't think it should be too surprising that this 32 ohm headphone is not quite as resolving as the 600 ohm DT880. However, I do find it easier to listen to a point where some details are easier to pick out because I can increase the volume of this higher than I can on the DT880 due to it having about half as much of the peaky treble. I still find it relatively resolving, not enough to severely differentiate between certain tracks. So if I have a track that's not quite perfectly mixed versus one that's masterfully mixed, I'm not going to be able to differentiate as well between them. But if you listen to something that's very poorly mixed, it's certainly going to stand out, as it should with most audiophile grade headphones. And I did notice the same thing in game design. Most games are pretty good about their sound these days, but there were occasionally times where I would notice a specific sound effect that didn't seem like it was up to par with the others. This didn't necessarily ruin the immersion, but it does speak volumes for the quality of driver they're using in this headphone that they're still marketing towards a gaming audience. Definitely a good thing in my opinion. Now, separation is something that I think goes hand in hand with resolution, but in this case it steps out a little bit because I find separation is a little bit easier on this than on the DT880 600 ohm. For this specific reason, because like I said before, I think that since it has less treble than the DT880 600 ohm, I am able to pick things out a little bit more clearly. With that increase in treble on the DT880, it can sometimes be difficult to see past, which I still love the DT880. I'm not trying to downplay it because I still use it all the time. I still think it's a great headphone. But with this one having the treble a little bit more in line with the rest of the frequency response, it's a bit easier to see the forest for the trees. And amplification. This is easy to drive. It's a 32 ohm high efficiency dynamic. I've been able to drive it off my phone just fine. I've used the Type-C Apple dongle. I've used the Lightning Apple dongle. I plugged it straight up to my laptop and I can drive it very comfortably at 30 to 40% volume. However, I have noticed if I plug this up to an Atom or an L-amp or almost any decent amplifier, I do get more impactful low frequencies and a bit more comfortable high ranges. Specifically, when I plug this up to the IFI X-Can, the little Bluetooth piece, I actually got slightly less bass impact, but I got a more forward resolving mid-range out of it. So this is going to pick up the differences between amplifiers. If you're wondering what to get for it, if you just want something cheap, I honestly think an Atom or a Liquid Spark would do just fine for it. And I don't think this is going to play too well with tubes, unless you're using some tubes that are going to maybe make it warmer or more mid-forward. So I would probably stick to solid state, probably on the more affordable end of solid state, because I don't think this is going to benefit to really super high-end amps, but you will be able to differentiate some between them. And you'll definitely benefit some from having a amplifier with a little bit of extra drive, even if you don't need to use the headroom and gain. So if you've made it this far in the video, I have one thing I'm going to say that's probably going to tip the tables a little bit, and that's that this headphone is kind of thrown off my recommendations list. And the reason being because I feel like this, while not quite the level of the DT1990, I think this is getting us about 80% of the way to the performance of a DT1990 for less than half the cost. So that said, The TYGR300R, I think, is an absolutely excellent headphone if you don't want something completely neutral. You want something with a little bit less treble than the normal Bear dynamics, but maybe still want a little bit of a V-shaped sound. I personally bought one, and I think gamers and audiophiles alike are both going to like this headphone. So guys, I hope you liked this video. If you did, please leave a like down below and a comment. Let me know what you want to see in the future. If you want to get active in the community, you can at forum.hifiguides.com, and as always, don't forget to stick around and subscribe for more videos like this. Until the next one, guys. Peace.